There are some periods in history where good is bad and bad is good, up is down, and so forth. And we're living through one of those right now.
Would the system of monarchy be a better system overall as compared to democracy for reining in the abuse of power?
I would actually trace this period of our history back to the Protestant Revolt. What nobody ever speculated on was that you could have a mixed government out of the three worst kinds. And that, I think, we've achieved. We're able to combine despotism, oligarchy, and mob rule, and it's wonderful.
And we're buying it in droves. By the way, my name is Joe McClane. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below. Given what we are seeing in, the United Kingdom with riots, with censor police, I mean, they've threatened Americans on social media posts in England. How about Venezuela, for instance? Venezuela seems to be off the charts in its abuse of power these days. So we do seem to see an upward tick on the abuse of power. What is the purpose of power? What role does it play in society? And can we reestablish some good uses of it? Well, there's an interesting article over Crisis Magazine by Charles Coulombe, The Limits of Power. I would subtitle that Legitimacy, Authority, and Power. And Charles Coulombe joins us now to discuss this. Charles, thank you for your time. We really appreciate having you on the team.
Thanks for having me here. Great to be here.
I'd love to, if we had all the time in the world, I'd want to kind of go back and figure out, where did we go wrong? Was it the French Revolution? Was it Enlightenment? I mean, what was it? The Garden of Eden? Where do we get off track? But I think it's safe to say that we see an ever increasing abuse of power in society today. Would you say that would be fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things you have to bear in mind when you're looking and trying to make sense out of things historically is that there's some things that are, because of the fall, that are quite literally perennial in the human condition. I mean, some bad things, a lot of good things, of course, but there are certain bad things that you have all the time, everywhere, whenever. That's why there's no heaven on earth. But it is certainly true that some periods are, one would have to say, worse than others. There are some periods in history where good is bad and bad is good, up is down, and so forth. And we're living through one of those right now. If you would ask me to give a particular date, of course, the Garden of Eden is always hovering there. And if you wanted to say who's responsible, well, ultimately the world, the flesh, and the devil. But in the immediate, I would actually trace this period of our history back to the Protestant Revolt. But having said that, it's also important to bear in mind that at the same time, good things were happening. Saints were being made, discoveries were being made, the faith spread across the globe. It's never complete darkness. So it would be easy to say, well, up until 1517, everything was wonderful, and ever since, everything's been bad. Well, no, it's not quite that simple. In general, the aspirations and ideals of society were higher. But whether or not things were better depends upon the place and time subsequent.
So,
I mean,
was there ever an ideal time that, was it Christendom? Can we look back with rosy glasses and say Christendom was where power was legitimately used and enforced and everybody loved it and they were happy to be obedient? Was there ever a good time?
Not like that. But there have been better times. In other words, there's a difference between a migraine and a slight headache. And right now, we've got a splitting migraine.
Amen, yeah.
So I would say, too, that the ups in the era of Christendom were higher than we're capable of achieving. The downs were not as low as we're able to do. One of the funny things about not just medieval, but also classical governmental philosophy was they had the idea that there were three kinds of good government and three evil shadows. The three kinds of good government were monarchy, what they call aristocracy, which is ruled by a group, and then what they called polity, which was ruled by the majority of stakeholders, i.e. taxpayers, veterans, etc. As they were concerned, though, each of these had evil shadows.
Mm.
So for monarchy, you had despotism. For aristocracy, you had oligarchy. And then lastly, but not leastly, for polity, you had democracy, mob rule. Now, they said then also that the best form of government is a mixed one. It includes monarchy, aristocracy, and polity. And in the eyes of our medieval fathers, this was the king and the estates. That was mixed government, and they thought that was the best. What they never came up with, what nobody ever speculated on, was that you could have a mixed government out of the three worst kinds. And that, I think, we've achieved. We're able to combine despotism, oligarchy, and mob rule. And it's wonderful.
And we're buying it in droves.
Yeah, well, I mean, St. Thomas and Aristotle never even dreamed of it. We've shown them.
Look what we can do. How proud we must be. So
I am.
What would be then, okay, you say in the article, you say in and of itself, power is an instrument, a tool, and so by definition, morally neutral in and of itself. In medieval times, power was diffuse. The king, the nobility, the church, the gentry, the merchant, craft guilds, even the peasants had and serfs had some. Today, as the COVID lockdown showed, it is concentrated. You know, I think we suffer from revisionist history. So if I think back to medieval times, the serf is a poor slave. He's told what to do by everybody. He's a victim of the whole process. I think we've been trained to think of history in these sort of weird ways. I would argue so that we can swallow the pills that they're dishing out these days. Is that a fair statement?
Partly. But also remember that all of us, and this even includes the creatures who are our masters, all of us constantly indulge in self-justification. Now must be the best time, because if it weren't, we wouldn't be ruled by such wonderful people. And if I were one of the rulers, I would say it must be one of the best times because I'm ruling, and I'm wonderful by definition. Right. I mean, I'm in charge. No era of the earth ever had me sitting in the driver's seat, and I'm so wonderful.
Yeah.
So, I mean, partly it's intentional in the sense of getting a program across, yes, but also it's part of the great love of self-delusion on both the part of rulers and ruled. That's one of the gifts of the fall.
Okay, so we're seeing the abuses. I would argue that we're seeing them in a greater frequency. Is this a byproduct? Okay, I'm a traditional Catholic, so by definition, I'm supposed to also be a monarch. So after World War I, we saw the death of monarchs all across Europe and the restructuring of Europe, and it seems to have never recovered from that. I think World War II just accentuated those problems even more. Yeah. So is the current wave of democracies that we've seen since the 19th century, since in the 20th century, are they inherent to the abuse of power? Would the system of monarchy be a better system overall as compared to democracy for reining in the abuse of power?
Well, I mean, there are monarchies and there are monarchies. I wouldn't have wanted to live under the Qing emperors in China or the Ottoman sultans. But having said that, they were still, both of those were still better than what replaced them. So, you know, by monarchy, we can define all sorts of things. But I would say that the best sort of monarchy and the best sort of government was the kind of thing envisioned by our Catholic and some Protestant forebears, the Jacobites in the Vendée, in Spain with the Carlists, Portugal with the Miguelists, the Legitimists. And that basically rested on four ideas. The altar, that is to say, the place of the church in defining civil life and so on and so forth, and giving legitimacy and authority to the state. The throne being a king or a monarch, an emperor, who had sufficient power to be able to, A, protect his subjects from being attacked from the outside, and B, from killing each other. Or as Franz Joseph put it, when he was asked by Teddy Roosevelt, what do you see your role as being? He said, protecting my people from their politicians. I think that probably defines it pretty well in terms of where the throne should be. The third was provincial rights, local liberties, what we would call subsidiarity.
Mm.
The fourth was class cooperation. Uh, you could call it distributism, solidarism, corporatism. They had many names for it, usually deal with one aspect. But the idea of all the different elements of society working together as a family under the fatherhood of the king. And then fifthly, there was a sort of more or less vague idea of Christendom as a family of nations, as a Respublica Christiana. Well, that was basically what was behind the notion of traditional monarchy. And the theorists of this sort saw the centralization that created the modern state in the 17th, 18th centuries as an aberration. And many of them held that it was directly responsible for the French Revolution and the rise of the Enlightenment before it. But then again, you get into the fact that the Enlightenment was also a reaction to the horrors of the religious wars after the Protestant Revolt. You see, all these things, one of the things we have to get away from is the idea that separation of church and state exists. It doesn't. Every state has an animating philosophy that gives legitimacy to the rulership, that gives the rules, supposedly. And it doesn't have to be religious. Communism was the state church of the Soviet Union.
Mm.
And this weird sort of strange liberalism / wokery that we have today is the state church of the most Western countries. Now, it doesn't mean that my church won't be separate from the state. You bet. But the state necessarily, to exist, has to have this animating philosophy, this quasi-religious principle that's above mere utilitarianism. It's the only way they're able to justify the use of power at all. And power, no matter how abused, those in power have to justify somehow their actions. I mean, that's why they come up with rhetoric instead of just saying, you'll do as you're told, warm boy, and like it. Secure, the new prime minister, has all sorts of high-sounding phrases to justify his use of force against free thought on the internet.
Yeah.
And that verbiage of his is, you might say, inspired by the theology of the current state church. Calling it a theology might be a bit of a stretch, but even if you say there is no God, or if there is, he's not important, that is a theological statement.
One of the things that stands out to me about that particular story, what's going on in the UK right now, and I see this also in France, but I also see it in America as well, as we're coming up on a very contentious election this November, is there is what they're calling a far-right movement. There's a conservative movement. But how conservative really are they? What does it say when the so-called conservatives are almost as bad as the progressives? Take UK, for instance. They're upset about the illegal immigration crisis that's happening in their country. Rightfully so. It's not good for the immigrants. It's definitely not good for the natives. It's not good for anybody because it's out of control and it seems agendized. But they don't want true conservatism. They don't want God back in their life. They're not welcoming God back at the center of their life, and it's certainly not the center of their government nor the center of their laws. And in your article, you talk about the relationship between legitimacy, authority, and power.
Yeah.
And if you remove God from that equation, then it could never actually work. And I see the same thing in America. The MAGA nation, as it's so called, really wants the Kid Rock concert. They want the arm's length tattoos. They want money in their back pocket, blue skies and sunshine, and a good time. But that's kind of the extent of their world's desires, and that will never actually get us to where we got to go. That's not going to be the rebirth of a great nation, in my opinion. What say you?
I agree. I mean, the sad truth of the matter is that we have been on a long-term binge, and the price is coming due. A lot of people my age, and I'm 63, will tell you, and they'll be right, that they remember a time when things were much more prosperous, when things made sense, so on and so forth. It's all true compared to now. But what they don't realize is that it was, well, it's a little bit like comparing the tertiary stage of a terrible disease to the secondary or primary stage.
Mm.
You know, the good old days, we just had these odd pains here and there. So much better than now when we got chunks falling off our face.
Wow.
Uh, it's just the way it is. And you get nostalgic for those good old primary days when we were just recently infected. But you see, we can't really argue with the infection, and that's our problem. And what is that infection? That infection is putting man above God, and in so doing, completely overturning any real order, any real authority, and any real common good. Because what we end up doing, I mean, again, I hate to invoke Christendom. We go back to the ideals. The last end of man is his salvation. And in those days, the idea was the church, the sacraments, assisted man directly in saving his soul. But the state assisted the church, one, financially, but also through providing or attempting to provide, of course, nothing's perfect, through attempting to provide a setup where you weren't so worried about safety or starvation that you could worry about your soul. But that had a directly religious application. Now, by that, I don't mean to say the state didn't have a proper sphere of its own. Of course it did. But it was secondary and allied to the primary role of the church, which in its own sphere, its own way, was also the primary interest of the state. Now we've completely upended all that.
Mm.
And what we've replaced it with is the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number. That's what we think of, what we modern people consider to be the entire and best common good. And the problem with it is that it just doesn't bloody work.
Mm.
It just doesn't work. You know, I can put as much craftsmanship as I like into constructing a pair of wings. That's great. I can work 20 years on making them and then jump off a cliff and I'll still hit the bottom. But what about these beautiful wings I made? Well, it doesn't matter. It's not how things work. And really, in a lot of ways, modernity has been an escape from reality, a headlong flight into fantasy. Things are this and such because I say they are.
Mm.
I know I look like an old white man, but I'm actually a young black girl.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you, Charles. That's great. Thanks. And I agree, in return for your supporting my delusion, I'll support yours. And that's the greatest good for the greatest number.
Yeah, that was the display we saw at the Olympic Games in Paris just this last couple of weeks with the mocking and of the blasphemy of the Last Supper, but the boxing matches, you know, having women duke it out with biological males that are obviously going to dominate. The person who wins the gold in the female boxing category is an actual male, and the world stands by and accepts that as somehow okay.
Well,
that
they do.
Is so bizarre.
And also bear in mind something else they did, which was the mockery of the murder of Marie Antoinette.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
Now that thing, we're bearing in mind that she sort of symbolizes, I mean, she was a wonderful lady and really a martyr in the end. That aside, she symbolizes the thousands, perhaps a couple of million, of people who died from 1793 to 1815. I mean, it was as tasteless as having a display of Anne Frank at Belsen would have been.
Mm.
You know, but see, modern people have a hard time with things. You see, modernity clouds the brain, and you really only see your project. You don't see any other consideration. It's all about me. But the problem is that ultimately, a billion free wills set loose to pursue what they consider pleasure is a recipe for chaos. And as that goes on, because you can't really function that way, the masters of society will become ever more repressive, simply to make things function.
Yeah.
To put this in another, sorry.
I was going to ask the question: is it a day late and a dollar short? Is it gone too far and we can't put the genie back in the bottle? Can we fix this thing? Is it possible? Because I'm just thinking, like, even of the Trump assassination on July, was that 13th? It's been about a month now, and we still have never been shown a map where the kid's van was parked, or why it had Arizona license plate tags when the kid's from Pennsylvania on it. There's so much information we still don't know. Apparently, we're not entitled to know. All we're left with is conspiracy and conjecture. And the government authorities seem to be okay with that. That's a symptom of a much greater problem. And it just makes me want to ask the question, is it too late? Can this be fixed?
Those are questions that, in a larger sense, yes, it will be fixed one way or the other. Not to worry. Don't you fret. It'll sort itself out. Oh, yes. Now, how that sorting out will look and whether it'll be pleasant, that's a whole other kettle of wax. I'll put it this way. Societies tend to collapse in a certain way. And then, now sometimes there are revivals before they go all the way down to the bottom. In history, it's happened time and again. And then sometimes there aren't. And they do hit bottom and you have chaos. And out of that chaos emerges something new. And it's very important when you're tempted to despair or to throw up your hands, remember that you and me and the vast majority of people you'll be dealing with descend from the survivors of the Black Plague, from the survivors of the Mongol invasions. Our ancestors went through a lot of garbage, worse than anything we've seen. And we know that they came out of it through one important fact, even if we don't know anything about them. And the important fact is we're sitting here having a conversation.
Amen, yeah.
So Genghis Khan and Tamerlane could leave their pyramids of skulls, and they did. They'd conquer a city. It was a warning to others, all sorts of terrible things could happen, but we came through it. Now, obviously, everybody who came through it is now dead. And I'm saying this because we always have to remind ourselves of eternity. Right now, you and I'm going to get really Catholic on you. You and I have been placed in this particular time and place because from all eternity, God knew it was the best time for you and me to save our souls. If it had been better, we would have been put in the last days of the Roman Empire, or when Columbus discovered America, or during the French and Indian War. But no, we were placed here and now. And that was done very deliberately. Wasn't by accident. God didn't blink and say, oh my heavens, look at these morons I put in there. No, we are all here right now at this present time because God decided we should be. The historical backdrop against which each of us have to work out our salvation in fear and trembling, kind of put in that bit there. That backdrop is on one level just the backdrop. Now, what we do in terms of that backdrop, how we react, how we live with it, there are two results. One is, and the more important for us personally, is how it affects our personal salvation. Because, of course, if you and I go to heaven, all of this garbage will be like a bad dream. The secondary thing, however, is the effect we have, however large or small, on the course of events. Now, I don't mean to say that we shouldn't try as hard as we can to solve things to the best of our ability. I don't mean that at all, because that in turn is part of our salvation, you see.
Yeah.
Doing our best. I mean, think of Joan of Arc. Her salvation was not dependent on her saving France. But saving France was certainly a large part of what she ended up doing. And so it is with us. So when you say, has it gone too far? Who knows? Who cares? We have to try our best to fight against it. We have to play our part. We have to do our thing. And maybe we'll succeed, and maybe we won't. But if it conduces to our personal salvation, we'll have done something. And something, I mean, the most important thing we can do. And who knows? Remember, it's always the losers that get the best songs.
That's great.
You know,
well, then I can't wait to hear the songs about my life. Praise be to God.
Well, I have to say that as groups, not as individuals. But I mean, think about it. You know, we listen to Jacobite songs.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Who listens to Whig ballads? You know, yes, we won that Culloden and we stole their land. I mean, nobody sings stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, for sure. It's funny you bring that up because we do listen to a lot of Scottish folk music in my house, and I was just talking to my son the other day about like the Corries or whatever singing these Jacobite tunes, and I'm like, they're not Catholics. Like if Bonnie Prince Charlie showed up at the door today, they wouldn't support his cause. I mean, this is just silly, but they sing them all the time. It's
well, of course they do. But, and here's the big but, nevertheless, it shows the compulsion of the good old cause.
Yeah.
And when you think that every country in Europe, and many of them beyond the seas, had their own version of the good old cause, of that vision of monarchy that I mentioned earlier, that's what Bonnie Prince Charlie was fighting for, that kind of monarchy.
Yeah.
The 5 points I elucidated were very much the Stuart program, as they were the Bourbon program during the wars in France and in Spain and so on and so on and so on. So, and they're the ones that get all the good music, not least because, remember one thing about lost causes. Whatever else they did, they're not responsible for what we've got now, whatever that is, whatever the lost cause.
Yeah. Let's turn to the church, though, because, okay, so a second ago you said, basically you said we have to be faithful, maintain our state of grace, live our vocation, maintain our state of life, pursue virtue. And then I guess it doesn't really matter what goes on around us at that point. Okay, I think that's pretty spot on. So from that same perspective, then, how much should we care or not care or be personally invested in the scandals that come out of the Holy Mother Church, out of the hierarchy of the Vatican? There's so many people who are fiducia supplicans, amoris laetitia, traditionis custodes. I mean, the hits go on and on and on, don't they? And lately, they never stop. I mean, it's like batting practice over there at the Vatican these days. So should we just ignore all of that? I mean, I cover these stories all the time on this show. Should I not? Should we just talk about living in a state of grace? Or what would be the appropriate response to those abuses of power?
It's actually the same. Because the fact of the matter is, remember I told you there's no real separation of church and state. And the problem is that in this era, remember the church has always had problems, but they vary from age to age. They're never the same. We never had all bishops but 5 denying the divinity of Christ until we did, and it's never happened since. We didn't have 3 popes until we did, and it hasn't happened since. I mean, the church goes through a different kind of Calvary in every age. And very often, not always, thank God, but often enough, those in charge are responsible for that Calvary. Hence the famous quip, I think it was Cardinal Consalvi, when Napoleon said to him, I could end your church like that. And Consalvi replied, Your Majesty, we Romans have been trying to do that for 2 millennia, and we haven't succeeded. You're not going to.
Yeah, good luck. Yeah.
So I mentioned that again as a background. Now, I wrote a piece about this current pontificate. I called it Pornocracy 2, Electric Boogaloo, which it's like the original pornocracy of the 900s without any of the good artwork or the taste or all that's lacking.
You don't love Marco Rupnik's work? I mean, everybody else seems to.
Not particularly. I know, and it's at the Chaplain Supreme, so in New Haven, so I should adore him. I know, but the truth is that the church and the world always reflect each other, for good and for ill. And right now, just as in the Middle Ages, very often bishops tend to be like feudal barons. Today, bishops tend to be like business executives, like corporate people.
Yeah.
Because that's the world that the church lives in, and it absorbs some of it. Pope Francis is like, in so many ways, acts like the head of a particularly badly run corporation. And when I say badly run, the church right now is a little bit like a car company that's urging buyers to use public transportation. That's not really very smart.
Right.
And if it were a business, the CEO and the board would be fired by the stockholders straight away. But of course, that's where because the church is a divine institution, that's exactly where the simile fails. No one can judge the Pope. No one can put him out of office, no matter how evil he may be. And that's one of the great paradoxes of church history. We have had evil popes. My personal favorite is John the 12th, who tried to sell the papacy 3 times, pocketed the money, and then laughingly said, "Well, of course you can't sell the papacy, idiot." He died in his mistress's arms from wounds he received from her husband. Very romantic story. I've always wondered if the husband went to hell for killing the Pope or heaven for defending the marriage bond. Anyway, whatever the case, he at the same time, however, was the Pope who signed the Charter of Cluny, the monastery, thus unwittingly helping to prepare for a period of reform in the church.
Interesting.
The evil Julius III, who was a horrible, horrible creature, he was elected Pope. He picked up this boy on the streets of Naples, made him a cardinal, and then built him a villa in Rome where they had orgies. This is in the 1550s. But, and not of a, shall we say, not of a mixed gender variety.
Oof.
And he raised such a stench in the nostrils of even the anti-reform cardinals that they elected Paul IV. And that set the stage for the beginning of the recalling of the Council of Trent and the reform of the church. So even the evil Julius III and all of his amusements, they played their part. Now, one of the thoughts medieval folk had about bad popes and bad monarchs is that there were punishments from God for our sins. Now, we don't like to think that we're sinful people, I know. We also like to think that our fathers and grandfathers were. But stop and think about what those same fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers tolerated. In a lot of ways, Pope Francis is a pope after the heart of many, many Catholics. And that's something, it's the reductio ad absurdum in a way. We have a pope who thinks that papal power is whatever he decides it is.
Yeah.
It's almost as though he's the living cartoon of the papacy that Protestants and Orthodox have always had. Just as the schism between Moscow and Constantinople is the living cartoon that Catholics have always had of Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
I hate to get prophetic, but it's almost as though all of these different things were symptoms of the same reality. The chickens are coming home to roost, and we are paying a long-term debt. Now you ask, should we pay attention to the problems of the church? Of course we should. What we need to avoid is the idea that the sky is falling. Now the sky will fall. The end of the world will come one day. Okay. You bet.
Yeah.
And it may be today. It may be 5,000 years from now. There was a very famous theologian who said in the gospel, "No man knows the day nor the hour." And he was a fairly solid theologian.
He was
Well,
a
I don't
good
know that
dude.
he had any degrees or anything.
Yeah.
At any rate, he was certainly I think that's very much the position we're in right now.
Okay, so in your article, actually, you talk about how laws are to serve the common good. They should be based on natural law. It's kind of like what the Catechism talks about. Like, why do we have freedom? We have freedom to do the right thing. We do not have freedom to do the wrong thing. Similarly,
Correct.
laws, their purpose is to do the right thing. And natural law is what is something that binds all human beings, despite or in spite of the creeds that anyone might profess. We know you can't murder. You know, these things are true for all human beings. They're not true for some and then not others. And yet, again, going back to something I said earlier, we live in a day and a time where the conservatives are almost as bad as the progressives. IVF,
Yes.
contraception, abortion. So-called conservatives don't defend traditional marriage between a man and woman anymore. Of course,
No.
drone warfare is great. I mean, I recommend it to all my besties. So, I mean, we're seeing all kinds of an abuse of power. I think we've thrown natural law out the door. And again, to go back to the church now, I don't think you have to be a theologian. I don't believe you have to be a Thomist or have advanced degrees to know that you can't bless two homosexual men, two lesbian women, or any combination thereof. Like,
Yeah.
I don't need a document out of the Vatican that tells me I can do that or can, because we all know you can't do that. But
Yeah.
yet we do see this abuse of power. I set all that up to ask this: do you must think? It sounds like you think that history's cyclical, and that we might be this pendulum might swing the other way. Do you think that the next conclave might bring about another Paul IV? Is that possible, given the fact that Francis has stacked the deck in the College of Cardinals?
Well, that's true. He has stacked it, but you've got to remember that he didn't know the vast majority of people he stacked it with.
Mm.
He knew the ones everybody knows. He knew Cardinal Seepage. He knew Cardinal Tobin. He knew Cardinal McElroy. He knew those guys. He knew Tuchita and Cardinal, what's his name, the head of the DDF. But the vast majority of his picks have been chosen for their obscurity. They don't know him. He doesn't know them. They don't know each other. Now, I don't know because, oddly enough, I'm not a cardinal and I don't plan to attend the conclave, but which is probably for everyone's good.
You could identify as a cardinal. I'm sure that'll get you a ticket.
Yes, I could, and I could appear in red and say, "I'm here." You know, what's the deal? But I could, but nevertheless, I think that in all likelihood, this time with the St. Gallen Mafia all gone thanks to age and death, I think that the Merler Burke crowd will probably be the best organized cardinals. So we may get something very different. I hope so. I pray to God we do. Now, it could be, of course, on the other hand, the pornocracy goes on. But even if it does, it's unlikely. You see, part of the unique element of this pontificate is that the Holy Father represents that age group that were the young, quote unquote, Vatican II priests of my childhood. And seemingly every parish had one. There's a young guy comes in, he's got to break everything up, and does. Very ignorant, very nasty, very stupid, and yet very in charge. An adept at sweeping away recalcitrant pastors, even. These guys were a big part of my growing up. And now, those that aren't out of the priesthood or in jail are in charge. And on one level, we have to outlast them, which you'll be able to do. I'm afraid, as a comedian who's a couple of years older than me put it, I just wish the boomers would go. Unfortunately, when they do, they're taking me with them.
Yeah. I do have some hope anyway that the next generation of seminarians and younger priests are more orthodox, more conservative, more traditional, maybe more zealous. However, I think the flip side of that same coin is they're entering into a system that I believe is stacked against them, and they become careerists in the not too distant future.
This is a problem, but remember, the church doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a very good chance that in the nearest future, in many places, the church will be persecuted for the irreducible minimum that you cannot go beyond. And then careerism will vanish. Persecution and martyrdom have a strange way of taking care of careerism. Now, mind you, I could be wrong. I can't foretell the future. In the immortal words of Doris Day, that great theologian, que sera, sera, what will be, will be. But remember that, again, time and time again, the church has gone through horrible periods. She always emerges. And unless these are the last days, she will again. It will not look like what we remember. Just like the Holy Roman Empire was not the old Christian Roman Empire. It was and it wasn't. There was certainly continuity, but it didn't look the same. And that, you said earlier, I appear to see history as cyclical. Well, to a degree, but cycles going in a direction.
Yeah.
You see, in other words, it's not just this endless wheel that goes round and round. It's leading us downward through time. And I say downward because we have our Lord's own saying, think ye when the Son of Man returns, he will find faith upon the earth. But of course, as against that, Our Lady of Fatima tells us that in the end, her Immaculate Heart will triumph, and there will be a period of peace. We have the prophecies of the reign of the Sacred Heart, of the last emperor, things like that. Well, I think that we'll have at least one or more periods of semi-triumph or real triumph for the faith and for Christendom until the end.
You mentioned the reign of the Sacred Heart. How about the reign of the French monarch? There's a prophecy about that. Do you think, regardless of what you believe about Henry V, especially being whether or not it's Marie Antoinette's, the ancestor of Marie Antoinette, that's very fascinating to me, to say the least. Do you think monarchy will be made great again? Or has that ship sailed and we're stuck with democracies and republics?
No, I think democracies and republics are on their way again to the reductio ad absurdum. I think they'll be replaced. Better, of course, would be restorations of the old dynasties, but monarchy will reemerge. I believe before we get there, we'll probably go through strongmen, certainly in our country. The only way I see the country surviving the fracturing it's going through will be some sort of a strong man. I pray that he's Franco and not Cromwell. But the problem with a strong man is you don't know.
Yeah.
And once you get him, everything's dependent on him. So if he's good, if he's bad, if he's crazy, if he's sane, all these things you can't tell in advance. And very often you can't tell until he's settled in power. And then you find out. Oh boy, do you ever.
Ooh, that sounds more like Nancy Pelosi. You got to pass it to know what's inside of it. That's a little scary.
Well, unfortunately, it's true. Same with Nancy Pelosi. And she's scary all by herself.
That's true. Yeah. Well, Charles Coulombe, I'm grateful for your time today. It was a great article, The Limits of Power over crisismagazine.com. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes, but I highly encourage everyone to give it a read and go through it. We do live in interesting times. Dare I say, we live in not boring times. At least it's not boring, right? I mean, that's fair.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, people ask you, what's your source of news today? What news source do you trust in these times? I tell them coast to coast, George Norrie.
Lizard people. I got it.
It's all alien abductions and lizards, as far as I'm concerned.
That's right.
Well, if you can't tell what's true, then it might as well at least be amusing.
Yeah. Entertaining. Yes. 100%.
Yeah. I mean, it's like if you say to me, all right, you're stuck with false religion. Okay, fine. I'll take dancing Tiki Islanders over a Baptist meeting any day.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if you can't have the truth, you've got to settle for entertainment value.
Yeah. Well, we got that in spades. Charles Coulombe, God bless you and God love you. Thank you for sharing your insight into your article today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.